Hi, Year 12. Okay, so we're moving on now. As I said to you, we would be. Remember, those essays are to be with me for Friday, please. Emailed through, so I've got them. And once I've got everybody's, I'll review them, mark them, and then I'll build some feedback into next week's lessons. But this is Friday's psychology lesson, and we're moving on slightly in the topic. We're going to be moving on to looking at phobias, which is one of the three disorders that we have to focus on. But in order to do that, what you're going to see is that we have to apply our knowledge from the approaches topic when looking at these disorders. So we're going to be applying the behavioural approach to phobias. Okay, so that's coming up in the next couple of lessons. So I thought it would be appropriate for your retrieval to retrieve your knowledge on the approaches. So give yourself 5 minutes. Don't use your notes and just fill in that table for me. So I want the assumptions of the approach and a strength and a weakness. And when I say assumptions, I know we sort of learnt those little phrases, if you like, for each of them, but develop that further. So, for example, don't just say we are what we learn. Tell me a bit more about what that approach says as to how we learn. Okay, and try and get as many keywords in there as you possibly can. So that's your retrieval. So pause me and give yourself 5 minutes to complete that. So let's have a look and see how you got on. I'm sort of in the way, aren't I? I'm going to move it over there. So the behavioural approach, and this is the one we'll be focusing on with phobias in the next couple of lessons, tells us that all behaviour is learned. We are what we've learned. We're born a blank canvas or a tabula rasa, and that learning happens in one of three ways, either through association, our classical conditioning, through reinforcement, whether that's positive or negative reinforcement, or punishment, and that's operant conditioning, or through that extra strand, which was obviously a later development, the social learning theory, which says, well, we imitate others, especially if we see them being rewarded for it, vicarious reinforcement. And we know the weaknesses of that are it ignores the role of nature. A lot of the research is based on animals, etc., etc. And a real strength of it, though, which is relevant here, is the real life applications, especially when looking at treating phobias. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on this behavioural approach, and we're going to be really thinking about how we can apply these ideas to understand why someone would have a phobia. Because if all behaviour is learned, that's abnormal behaviour as well. That's phobias. They must be somehow learned. So we'll really have to dig deep with that. As we move on through the topic, we'll be applying the cognitive approach to depression, and we'll be applying the biological approach to OCD. So it's important we review and revisit those. So I'll not talk you through what's there. Hopefully you had a lot of it anyway. But again, I would pause the video, pause me, and use that, and in a different coloured pen, just fill in any gaps and create yourself a couple of flashcards if you have got gaps that need to be filled. But that is going back to our very first topic when we started year 12. Okay, you'll see I've used some words like holistic there. That means thinking about the whole person. And machine reductionism, which was that nice criticism for the cognitive approach, that the brain isn't like a machine, but the cognitive approach tries to suggest that it is like a computer, so it reduces us down to just a computer. That's a nice way of saying it. Okay, so we're moving on and we're looking at phobias. So you need the next installment, if you like, of your knowledge organizer. Okay, so this is it. Print it out for your files if you can, but certainly make sure you save this electronically if you can't print. So we'll have to explore what the DSM says about it, what the different characteristics of somebody who has a phobia would be, how we explain phobias. This won't all be in today's lesson, obviously. How we explain it from the behavioural point of view, and therefore how we treat it from the behavioural point of view. So it's kind of what is it, why is it, and how do we treat it? And that's the way we need to approach the topic. Okay, so that's just really a reference for your knowledge organizer. Of course, it's not all the knowledge, it's the key things, it's prompts. So there's a lot more that sits behind that, you know that, but that's useful for creating flashcards and for testing yourself. Okay, so quick reminder then, or rather you're going to do a quick retrieval. We've come across a lot of letters so far in this topic. Two that are going to be relevant again for us today in today's lesson about phobias are the DSM-V and the GAF scale. So again, on a piece of paper in your, in your files, what do those letters stand for? So write it in full. What is it? What's it all about? And how is it used? In what way is it used? Who might use it? What would it be used for? Okay, so just have a go at reminding yourself about those new letter combinations that we've been looking at. Pause the video again, of course. Okay, so here's our answers. Let's just double check. So the DSM-V is, of course, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's the 5th edition. And what is it? Well, it's that reference tool, it's that manual, that book that's used by clinicians, that's a nice way of saying medical professionals, to identify and diagnose mental health conditions. So your medical professionals would use it to match up the patient's symptoms and say, oh, yes, okay, you've got this, this, and this. Oh, all right, I think you've got OCD or depression or whatever. Okay. And the GAF scale is the Global Assessment of Functioning scale from 0 to 100, which is used to assess how well someone's able to function. So we know we use this when we are applying the failure to function adequately definition, one of our 4 definitions that we have to know about. And so we would sort of identify where on the scale that patient belongs, and that allows us to identify, do they have a problem or not? If they're very low on the scale, of course they do. What intervention, what treatment is needed? Do we need to section them under the Mental Health Act for their own safety? Do we need to admit them to hospital? If they're down at 0 to 20, yes, we probably do. Okay, so it's useful for that. All right, so we're going to be thinking about that in particular in reference to phobias. So how does this all relate to phobias? Well, it's important we have a clear understanding of what a phobia is and when just a disliking becomes a phobia. Because you might not like dogs, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're phobic of them. And a medical professional is not going to put that label on you and say you have that problem. It is a mental health problem if you have a phobia. And we come to that conclusion when we use the failure to function adequately definition. Because if we look at what the DSM says, remember that's that manual, if we have a look, it says that a phobia is a marked and persistent fear, so it has to continue. It's not just a one-off, oh, I don't like that, it's continual, persistent, of a specific object or a situation. Exposure to the phobic stimulus nearly always produces a rapid anxiety response. So it does say nearly, but generally every time you are exposed to that thing that you were afraid of, you're going to immediately feel this anxiety. Fear of that phobic object or situation is excessive, so far more than a disliking, isn't it? And this is where the bit comes in about the failing to function adequately, because the phobic reactions, your reaction to it whenever you encounter that thing you're afraid of, will interfere significantly with the individual's working or social life. And also, going back a little bit, you will either avoid it or respond with great anxiety. Well, that's okay if what you're phobic of is something that you don't encounter very much in real life. Well, what if what you're phobic of is something that is all around us? That's massively going to have an impact on your social life, your working life, basically your ability to do anything. And there are some phobias like that. People are phobic of things which are everywhere. Birds, for example. It's quite a common phobia of birds. Well, you're not going to be able to leave your house, are you? So when a dislike of something becomes a phobia, it's because it's persistent, it creates this intense and this excessive anxiety, and because it's going to stop you from functioning adequately. And that's where we can see this definition really come into its own and be helpful to make that distinction between, yeah, we all dislike things. I don't particularly like dogs, but that's because I've never really had that very much to do with, I didn't have dogs as pets as a child. I don't now. I've never really had much to do with them. I wouldn't say I'm phobic of dogs and it doesn't interfere with my life in any way. Okay, so the DSM explains that this is an anxiety disorder. We can understand why. It creates a massive anxiety when you're faced with the thing that you're afraid of. And so it would place it alongside other anxiety disorders, such as OCD, which are, we're going to be doing later on in the topic, so I'm not going to go into it now. But these are disorders which create a real anxiety, a real fear and uncomfortableness. So here's an example, and this is actually taken from an exam question. The question was about something different. It was about phobias, but more about explaining them, which obviously we're not moving on to just yet. But I just picked the stem out, this item, because it helps us to see this as well, when a dislike becomes a phobia. So Kirsty's in her 20s, and she's had this phobia of balloons since she had a negative experience when she was younger, basically. But it's an extreme anxiety, extreme, so that excessive that the DSM talks about. And she avoids situations where there might be balloons, birthday parties. Well, when Kirsty grows a bit older, and if she has children of her own, that is going to be interfering with her life. She's not going to be able to go to any of her children's birthday parties or any of their friends' birthday parties. She might not be able to go to her friends' weddings. That is interfering with her social life. And because it's excessive, it's extreme, she's using that avoidance, we can see Kirsty has a phobia, as opposed to just not liking balloons very much. I know it probably sounds ridiculous and it sounds a bit funny to be phobic of balloons, but that is actually another common phobia. You'd be surprised which ones are common. And I'm going to give you a bit of a task towards that later on. So this is a video link. I'm not going to play it now, but when you open up the PowerPoint, literally click on the picture, it will take you. It's quite interesting. It talks about the common phobias, but it does so through using clips from films. And of course, in films, when they want it to be scary or unpleasant, they will use things that people are commonly phobic of and make them seem an awful lot worse. So they won't just use a dog, they'll use a Rottweiler attacking somebody. But it's quite a useful little summary to get you thinking about different types of phobias. Because I think it's very important when you're talking about phobias, when you're saying what does the DSM say about them, what are the characteristics of phobias, that you have a few examples in your mind, whether that be you've got arachnophobia, fear of spiders in your mind, fear of dogs, whatever, but just have a few, because it will really help you to apply your knowledge. So I wanted to bring this in a little bit, because I think this is relevant to phobias, and we'll come across this again in later topics, but I think it's relevant to phobias. Our human brain, we know, although not with absolute clarity in terms of the number of years, has evolved over millennia. Yeah. We haven't always been the complex, sophisticated, rational thinking beings that we are now. And we can talk about actually the evolution of the human brain, going from this sort of old brain, if you like, and the reptilian brain, to the new brain, the neo-mammalian brain, and we've still got bits of all of it. So it's evolved, it's grown, it's developed, we've got the best bits, but we've still got the bits that our ancestors would have had in that very primitive time. Now, this is relevant to phobias, because if I show you a bit more detail on that diagram, we start at the beginning, how our ancestors' brains would have been. Your old brain, reptilian brain, and we think this is about 500 million years ago, this was kind of active, is just really concerned with survival. When faced with fear, your old brain will ensure you have a fight or flight response. Your muscles are geared up. Some of the biologists amongst you will know about the fight or flight response. We do it next year when we look at biopsychology. But your muscles will be fired up. You'll be ready to either fight or run away. Okay, so the role of adrenaline kicks in. That's for your own survival. When you're faced with a predator or when you're faced with something, you had an instinct to reproduce, sexual instincts, sexual drives, and hunt. And so you were territorial. This is my land, yeah? And that part of our brain is still there. And sometimes when we don't override it with our more modern brain, it comes into our behaviours. We can see aspects of that sometimes. We see it with the sort of alpha male sometimes when boys get a bit aggressive. It's their reptilian brain really kicking in. They're being territorial. They've got these sexual drives. it's all about kind of being the alpha male. Our brain evolved. So it went through the kind of paleo-mammalian system, which was more about starting to be a bit more social as human beings and interacting and play, that sort of social stage. But we're going to really focus on this bit because this is our rational brain. This is the bit that really makes us human beings as we are today. We think, we reflect, we ask ourselves questions, we actually overthink. We are self-aware, we've got a sense of identity, and we regulate our emotions. So this bit down here, emotion, must eat, must have sex, that's just emotion. We've learned to regulate that. Yeah, but is that socially acceptable? Is now the right time and the right place? What impact might that have? We have things like empathy now. We think about how it might impact on others. Now, phobias fit into this because we are born with certain phobias. Actually, fear or phobia of loud noises, well, that's a protection thing, isn't it? That's a loud noise can be harmful to us. And a fear of falling. Again, that's harmful. We think those are the only two phobias or fears that you have innately when you are born. It's hard to test with a baby, isn't it? But we believe that to be true. Any other phobias, we could say we have learned, and we've learned them by overthinking. So our body, our old brain, is kind of pre-wired to protect us from things and to make us feel a little bit fearful. But it's our new brain overthinking everything and making these associations when they shouldn't really be made that's led us as human beings to be plagued with phobias and this anxiety. So actually we could argue that our brains are our reptilian brain, our evolutionary past has kind of set us up to suffer from phobias because it was about protecting ourselves. But as we've evolved, even though we don't need to be fearful of those things anymore, we still are because we overthink things and we're not managing to regulate our emotions as well as we should. So you would never be given a question on the exam about the evolution of the human brain in respect to phobias, but it could help you with your evaluation, definitely. And we'll think about that in a future lesson. And it could also just give you that context, yeah, about these innate fears and the ones that we must learn. So whenever we're looking at disorders, phobias, depression, OCD, we always break it down in terms of the characteristics in 3 categories. We look at the behavioural categories, or characteristics, I should say. We look at the cognitive characteristics, and we look at the emotional characteristics. Now, I like to put it simply, even though in our exam we would use the proper language. And I like to just say, well, emotional is how you feel if you have this disorder. Behavioural is how you act, and cognitive is how you think. It's as simple as that. So if somebody has a phobia, how do they act, how do they feel, and how are they thinking? So if we have a look here, and this is all in your textbook, how you feel when you're faced with something that you are phobic of is you feel intense anxiety and fear. And sometimes that doesn't go away. And you feel this unreasonable emotional response that nobody else would have when they were faced with that same thing. How you act, if somebody was looking at how you're behaving when you're faced with that, you might have a panic attack, you might suddenly get feverish and start sweating, short of breath, you might freeze, don't know what to do, and that's your body kicking in with your fight, flight, or freeze response. You might even faint, can't cope with it. Yeah, and this is what you would be doing, this is how you'd be acting, this is what people would be seeing in response to it. Also, what we see somebody do, how they act, is they're going to avoid situations where they think they might be faced with it. So Kirsty's going to avoid going to the party, yeah, going back to that example. Or they might decide, I can't avoid it. I can't not go to work just because I have a phobia of birds. I'm going to endure it. But they will endure it, put up with it, basically, but experience intense anxiety. So you can go one of either way. You can avoid it or you can endure it. But if you endure it, you're going to feel real intense anxiety, which is going to show because you might have a panic attack. You're not concentrating on anything else, so on. And then what's going on in here? What are you thinking if you have a phobia and you're faced with that phobic object? Well, you can't concentrate on anything else. You have what we call selective attention. So you're focusing on that thing that you're afraid of. You don't want to, but it's all you can think of because you've seen it, it's there. Or you've heard it and it's made you get that image in your head. And I'll talk about the Stroop test in a moment because it's quite a useful, interesting one. So it's irrational. You know they're irrational. You know that the bird isn't going to kill you, but you can't stop those irrational thoughts. So we have irrational thoughts and we have that distorted perception. You think it's got bigger teeth than it has. You think it's scarier than it is. You think it's more harmful than it is. A distorted perception. So you could get exam questions which ask you to outline behavioural characteristics of phobias, or cognitive or emotional, and you have to know which is which. And the easy way to think about it is just, is it feeling, emotional? Is it thinking, cognitive? Or is it how we act or behave, behavioural? Okay. So I mentioned the Stroop test alongside this selective attention. Again, on the PowerPoint, if you click on this image, it takes you to a video link. So you can pause me and watch that, and it will give you a bit more context about what the Stroop test is. Okay, so do that now. Okay, so you've had a look and you've thought about the Stroop test. So we know it's when you're faced with the name of a colour written in words, but the word will be in a different colour. And what you have to do is you have to say the colour, not the word. Now, hopefully you had a bit of a go when the video was playing and you saw how quick or not quick you were able to do that. You would get faster the more you practice. Your brain soon sort of understands what's going on and becomes attuned to it. Brains are very clever. But why is this relevant to phobias? Well, this has been used as a method of testing out this idea of selective attention. Because what happens is if the words are used, well, not the names of colours, but they were things linked to something you were afraid of or you were phobic of, you would be much slower at being able to say the colour because you would be so concentrating on the word and what the image that conjures up. So, for example, if you are a phobic of spiders, you're an arachnophobe, if the word said web and it was in the colour blue, it would take you ages to say blue because that word web, oh my God, web, spiders, oh. And you suddenly, all of your attention is not on the task you were meant to be completing, it is on that thing. And they've done this. Becker did this. He did it with people that had what we call a speech phobia, which is a phobia of speaking publicly. And he used words like stutter, blush, shy. Yeah, words that would conjure up that idea of having to speak in public or what might happen if you had to speak in public. And he found that when those speech phobic people were doing the Stroop test with those kinds of words, they were much slower than a control group, or when doing it with neutral words or positive words. Okay, so that larger number there, that's number of seconds, so that tells us they were slower than the others. So that's quite a nice piece of research to link to. So Stroop test supports this idea of the cognitive characteristic, the selective attention. Okay, so a few tasks for you. You've listened to me waffle on, you've watched a couple of video clips, few tasks to get you going with this. A little bit of a challenge research task for you. I've listed, these are actually the top 12 most common phobias. Some of them you'll know straight away. Some of them you'll have an educated guess at and then look them up to double check. But I want you to try and find out what the specific phobic object is. What's the thing that you're afraid of if you have that phobia? Okay. And then I've highlighted a couple of them. I've highlighted social phobia and agoraphobia. And I want you to just think about why I might have highlighted those. Think back to what the DSM-5 says about our categories of phobias. Okay, and you'll find a clue on your knowledge organizer. And we'll pick that up next lesson as well. So that's one task to do. Another task is to go to your retrieval questions in your pack that I sent you electronically, and there's now a number of them sort of halfway down that you should be able to do. Behavioral, cognitive, emotional characteristics. Quickly, what can you do? DSN, FFA, yeah, so we've done our definitions. We've now done the introduction to phobias. So start to work on your retrieval questions as well. And the other thing is to do yourself a set of flashcards based on today's lesson. So you should be starting to collect a nice little bank of flashcards for the psychopathology topic. I would recommend six or seven off the back of today's lesson. So you list the characteristics and you say what the DSM says about it. You list the 3 categories of phobias and you give 3 examples and the phobic objects that are linked to them. Yeah, so you've got some examples ready to draw upon as well. So use your knowledge organizer in constructing your flashcards, prepare them, leave them, come back to them. You could be doing the same with the ones you've already created, of course. Okay, so that's the end of today's lesson, Friday's lesson. If you're watching this before Friday and you haven't yet sent me your essay, then please do. And then next week, we'll move on to explain why people develop phobias using the behavioural approach. Okay, so have a nice weekend, take care, and I will speak to you next week.